As the sun began to set over the quiet, dusty streets of a small town, a lone motorcycle revved to life, breaking the silence. The rider, a black man with a leather jacket and a steady grip on the handlebars, was about to embark on a journey that would not only challenge his own identity, but also test the strength of a community that had long been divided by race and prejudice. His name, Marcus Ace Henderson, a man with a love for motorcycles, a fierce will to stand up for what's right, and an unshakable belief that change is possible, no matter the odds. But Marcus wasn't just any biker. He wasn't someone who fit the typical mold of what people expected when they thought about someone on two wheels. The leather-clad riders, often seen as a tight-knit brotherhood, were mostly white, often unwelcoming to outsiders who didn't look like them. Yet despite the challenges he faced being black in a world dominated by stereotypes and racial tension, Marcus had a passion that couldn't be suppressed. The road was his freedom, his escape, and his opportunity to prove that unity, not division, was what this world needed. It wasn't just the roar of his bike that made people take notice. It was the bold way he rode through those narrow streets, pushing through the glares and whispers, knowing all too well the painful stares that came with his presence. This wasn't just a ride for him. This was a battle against the racism that reared its ugly head every time he revved the engine. There were days when the harsh reality of hatred felt unbearable, when he'd be taunted by other bikers, made to feel like he didn't belong. But Marcus wasn't the type to back down. His story wasn't just about being a black biker in a world where people didn't always accept you. It was about a fight for respect, respect for his culture, his identity, and for the idea that change could come from even the unlikeliest of places. But as he pushed forward, he quickly realized that the fight he was up against was bigger than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about improving himself, it was about the community around him. A community that had been divided for so long, where people had forgotten how to trust each other, and where hate seemed to thrive in every corner. The tension was thick as Marcus continued to ride, defying the odds at every turn. He didn't know it yet, but something extraordinary was about to happen. He was about to become not just a figure in his community, but a symbol of hope, unity, and the power of standing firm against adversity. It wouldn't be an easy road, though. The battles ahead would test his strength, his resolve, and his faith in the goodness of others. As Marcus pulled up to the familiar local biker bar, a place he'd ridden past countless times, but never dared to stop, he felt the eyes on him once again. The air was thick with judgment. The familiar old crowd of bikers, their loud laughter echoing inside the building, didn't even look up as his engine cut off. He wasn't the first black man to roll through here, but he certainly wasn't welcome either. Or so he thought. But what happened next would change everything. Would he be able to break the barriers of racial tension that had plagued the area for years? Or would the deep-seated prejudice in the hearts of those around him prove too much for even the fiercest of riders to overcome? And more importantly, could one man with a motorcycle really make a difference in a place where hate had held the upper hand for so long? The answer, Marcus would soon discover, wasn't just up to him. It was up to the people who watched him ride, who saw the strength in his resolve, and who knew that maybe, just maybe, it was time for something to change. But that's a story for another time. Stay tuned as Marcus faces the most defining challenge of his life, one that will test not just his skills as a biker, but his heart, his courage, and his ability to bring together a divided community. Marcus sat still for a moment, letting the engine's hum fade into the night. The bar before him was like a fortress, a gathering place for bikers who'd lived by their own rules, many of whom had no use for outsiders. The usual crowd was inside, lost in their own world of laughter, loud conversations, and the clinking of glass. To them, Marcus was a stranger, To many, he was a threat. But to him, the bike was more than just a way of life. It was a chance to finally be seen, to be heard. He had grown up in a neighborhood where unity was scarce and racial tensions were a daily part of life. Marcus had learned early on that people saw you for what you looked like before they ever saw who you were. He had felt the sting of prejudice in school, in the streets, and in the most unexpected of places. But something inside him had always resisted, always pushed against those who tried to make him feel small. Motorcycles had been his escape. When he was on the road, it wasn't about race. It wasn't about where he came from. It was about the ride. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. The community was beginning to feel the shift. Racism had always been there, simmering just below the surface. But it wasn't something anyone talked about, not openly, at least. People avoided the issue, sweeping it under the rug as though pretending it didn't exist would make it go away. But the silence was deafening. Every time Marcus looked around, he saw the walls. They weren't just walls of brick and steel. They were walls built from years of mistrust, hate, and fear. As Marcus stood there, he wondered whether riding into that bar was the right move. He knew that once he stepped inside, there would be no going back. This could either be the start of something bigger than he'd ever imagined, or the beginning of a confrontation he didn't know if he was ready for. The old man who ran the place, Hank, was a notorious figure in the community. He was a man with a reputation, a man who had spent decades building a biker culture that didn't welcome change. Marcus had heard the stories, seen the glares from people who turned away when he rode past. But what choice did he have? He was already in too deep, and the thought of backing down felt like defeat. As he took a deep breath, the door to the bar swung open, and a familiar face appeared in the doorway. Jason. He was one of the few people Marcus knew in this town who didn't judge him for the color of his skin. Jason was a rider, like Marcus, but he had grown up in a different world, one that wasn't as clouded by the kind of hate that Marcus had known his whole life. The two had met years ago during a race, and despite their differences, they had formed a bond. But Jason was also tied to the community, and he knew the risks of challenging the status quo. "Don't do it, man," Jason said, his voice low, almost cautious. "You don't know what you're walking into." Marcus knew his friend was trying to protect him, but he also knew that this was the moment where he had to make a choice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of racism, of being made to feel invisible. "I have to," Marcus replied. "If I don't, nothing changes. If I don't, we stay stuck in this cycle forever." Jason didn't argue. He understood. But there was a quiet fear in his eyes, one that told Marcus just how much was at stake. Inside the bar, the air was thick with tension. The usual crowd was already starting to look over their shoulders, wondering who the new rider was. Some of them recognized Marcus. Some didn't, but all of them could sense that something was different. The way he walked through the door, not with hesitation but with purpose, made them uneasy. The music, loud and boisterous a moment ago, seemed to quiet down as he stepped further into the room. Hank, the old bartender, gave Marcus a quick glance before continuing his work, but there was no welcoming smile, no nod of acknowledgement. The rest of the room, however, had already started to whisper. The whispers grew louder, and Marcus could feel every single one of their eyes on him. It wasn't long before one of the older bikers, a man known as Joe, stood up from his seat. Joe had been in the community for decades, and if anyone could be called the unofficial leader of the group, it was him. With a thick, grizzled beard and a deep voice, Joe was the kind of man who didn't take kindly to outsiders. And Marcus, in his mind, was as much of an outsider as anyone could be. "Well, look who we got here," Joe said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A black man thinks he can just roll in here and join the fun. You're a brave one, I'll give you that." The room fell quiet. Marcus didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room bearing down on him. His hands, though steady on the table, clenched slightly. Joe's words weren't new to him. He had heard it all before. The insults, the jabs, the subtle and not so subtle ways people tried to put him in his place. But this time, it wasn't just a single person or a passing moment. This was the moment that would define him. "I'm not here to join the fun," Marcus said, his voice calm, but his words carrying weight. "I'm here because it's time for things to change." There was a long pause. Joe's eyes narrowed. It wasn't just the words that unsettled him. It was the quiet defiance in Marcus's voice. The bar was filled with a kind of charged silence, and Marcus knew that the battle had just begun. But just as things seemed to escalate, another voice cut through the tension, a voice that no one had expected. Hank, the bartender, who had been silently watching the exchange from behind the bar, finally spoke up. "Let the man speak," Hank said, his voice gruff, but with an unexpected authority. "He's not wrong, you know." The room froze. No one dared speak up against Hank. He was the one who kept things in check, the one who made the rules in this town. But what he said next shocked everyone. "We've been divided too long," Hank continued, his gaze sweeping over the room. "We've all let our past decide how we treat people, but maybe it's time to move past that." It was a bold statement. And in that moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Could it be? Could this be the moment when things finally started to shift? Could this town, this community, find a way to come together? But just as quickly as the hope appeared, the room filled with tension again. Not everyone agreed with Hank. The whispers returned, louder now, more forceful. Some weren't ready to let go of the old ways. And Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. But one thing was clear. The walls were starting to crack. And Marcus, whether he was ready or not, was standing right in the middle of it. The question now wasn't whether he could change things. It was whether the community was ready to change with him. The tension in the room was thick, each person frozen in place, uncertain of what to do next. Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes on him, some of them skeptical, others hopeful, and a few just angry. Joe, the man who had initially challenged him, stood there for a long moment, sizing Marcus up. For a heartbeat, it seemed like the whole bar was holding its breath. Then, as if on cue, Joe took a step forward. His eyes were no longer full of malice, but something else, something Marcus couldn't quite place. He was clearly weighing his options. The whole room seemed to wait for his reaction. Joe's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the table before he finally spoke again. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his voice still rough, but less hostile. "But guts alone won't fix things around here." Marcus stood firm. He had heard the words. He had seen the doubts in the eyes of others. But he also saw something new, a flicker of recognition, a moment of reflection. He was no longer the outsider. His presence, his words, had stirred something. The question now was whether that spark could catch fire. "I'm not asking you to change overnight," Marcus replied, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "But if we keep pretending this isn't a problem, it's just gonna keep burning us all. We're all just people trying to live, trying to make sense of what's going on. But we can't do that if we're looking at each other like we're enemies." The silence in the room deepened. Then, to everyone's surprise, Hank, who had been quietly observing, moved from behind the bar, and with a deep breath, he spoke again. "You want to know the real truth?" he asked, his voice low but powerful. "I've been riding with these guys for years. Seen the good, seen the bad. And the worst thing I've ever seen is how divided we've all become. It's not just about race. It's about respect, about trust. And for a long time, we've been so damn afraid of breaking the mold that we forgot what we were fighting for in the first place. We're fighting for freedom, for ourselves, for each other. The words hit like a punch to the gut. People were starting to murmur, looking around the room as if seeing each other for the first time in years. It was clear that something was shifting, but whether it would be enough to truly change the course of things, Marcus wasn't sure. And then, just when it seemed like the conversation might slip into a familiar silence, a voice came from the back. A young woman who had been watching from a corner booth, her arms crossed, a thoughtful look on her face. "He's right," she said, looking directly at Joe. "You can keep pretending, or you can finally face the fact that this is bigger than all of us. We've let hate fester for too long. We've let people like Marcus be excluded, be silenced. And that stops today." Her words were like a spark in dry tinder. Suddenly, people began nodding, shifting in their seats, and then the conversation erupted. Some were still hesitant, but others were starting to speak up about the way things had always been, and how tired they were of living in fear of the unknown. They were tired of being divided by things that didn't matter in the end. The realization was dawning on them. They were stronger together than apart. By the end of the night, Marcus had not only made his point, but he had found something he never expected to find in a place like this: a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose. The bikers, with all their rough edges and hardened shells, had begun to open up, acknowledging their past mistakes and their role in perpetuating the very divisions they despised. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. As the night drew to a close, Hank came over to Marcus, a look of rare sincerity on his face. "You did more than just talk tonight, kid," he said, offering Marcus a drink. "You made people listen." Marcus took the glass, his heart a little lighter than before. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like the community was ready to take that ride with him. As he revved the engine of his bike and pulled out into the night, the roar of his motorcycle didn't feel like a defiant cry anymore. It felt like the sound of a new beginning. A beginning where race, identity, and history no longer defined who someone could be, but where respect, understanding, and unity would pave the way forward. The journey wasn't over. There would be more struggles ahead, more battles to face. But Marcus knew one thing for certain: change had started, and nothing could stop it now. And as the town slept, its people unaware of the shift that had just begun, the road ahead was wide open, full of possibilities, full of hope, and ready for whatever came next. The walls weren't just cracking anymore. They were falling down, piece by piece. And for Marcus, that was the most powerful ride of all.